People in the Middle Ages ate spoiled meat and covered it with tons of spices to hide the taste. How many times have you heard this? Probably in a history documentary, maybe on a popular TV channel, or even at university. But what if I told you this is completely wrong? Today, we're putting one of the most widespread and most persistent myths in history on the table. And in doing so, we're inviting you to question not only the past, but also the way we think. Because this myth actually says a lot about how we view our ancestors. If you're ready, let's begin. First, let's acknowledge this. The spice myth isn't just an ordinary piece of misinformation. It's practically encoded into the DNA of popular culture. In Hollywood films set in the Middle Ages, you've probably seen enormous containers of spices sitting on banquet tables. In history documentaries, you've heard highly respected presenters say things like, "There was no hygiene in the Middle Ages, meat spoiled quickly, and therefore spices were essential." We even see famous historians repeating this claim in their books. So how can something this widespread be wrong? This is where we need to pause and think. The popularity of an idea is not a guarantee of its truth. And in this case, there are very specific reasons why the myth has become so widespread. Because this story does tell us something, but not about historical reality. It tells us about how modern people think about themselves. Let's move on to the weakest point of this myth, the economic reality. How many of the people who repeat this claim actually know how valuable spices were in the Middle Ages? Black pepper was sold at its weight in gold. A single kilogram of pepper could be worth a middle-class worker's monthly wage. Cinnamon, cloves, ginger, all of these were luxury goods imported from the Far East, brought over dangerous routes that took months to travel. They appeared only on the tables of the wealthy. Now think about this. You have a piece of meat in your storeroom that has started to spoil. Would you sprinkle black pepper worth its weight in gold over it to hide the taste? Or would you go to the market and buy fresh poultry? Today, no one would pour something as valuable as caviar over a spoiled sausage just to change its flavor, right? The same logic applies to the Middle Ages. Actually, it applies even more strongly. At that time, the relative cost of spices was far higher than the cost of caviar today. Buying fresh food was always cheaper and more sensible than buying spices. This simple economic fact alone shows just how absurd the myth really is. But economics is only one visible side of the story. Let's turn to science, to biology. Can spices mask the smell of meat? Maybe, but they cannot prevent bacterial poisoning. People in the Middle Ages may not have understood microbiology, but they were certainly not stupid. They knew very well what would happen if they ate spoiled meat: severe nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, and often death. In an era without the medicines we rely on today, food poisoning was far more deadly than it is now. Generations of lived experience taught medieval people a simple lesson: fresh food means survival. Moreover, when we look at medical writings from the period, we find dozens of texts warning about the dangers of spoiled meat. From Avicenna's Canon of Medicine to the texts taught at Europe's medical schools, such as those of the Salerno Medical School, all of them emphasize how crucial food freshness was. So when we imagine medieval people as so ignorant that they would eat rotten meat and simply pour spices over it, we are mistaken. They understood survival better than we do, because they had no other choice. Let's take a look at the social and commercial structure of the Middle Ages, because this is where things get truly surprising. In medieval Europe, the sale of meat was regulated through the guild system. These guilds enforced extremely strict rules, and they were no joke. For example, in 13th century Paris, the Butchers' Guild statutes clearly spelled out the punishment for selling spoiled meat: fines, expulsion from the guild, and imprisonment. In London, someone caught selling rotten meat would be forced to carry their own meat on their head and be paraded through the city square. This was not merely a symbolic punishment. It meant loss of livelihood and total social disgrace. In medieval cities, market inspectors checked meat sellers every morning. The color, smell, and texture of the meat were examined in detail. Any meat that was not fresh was destroyed immediately, and the butcher faced severe penalties. Moreover, freshness itself was a status symbol at the time. Wealthy people openly displayed the privilege of eating fresh meat. Game meat, freshly cut portions, animals slaughtered the very same day, these were things to boast about at the table. Eating spoiled meat, on the other hand, was a sign of poverty, desperation, and misery. When you consider the economic, biological, and social realities together, the idea that medieval people systematically ate spoiled meat is completely illogical and simply false. So where did this myth come from? And more importantly, why was it accepted so easily? This is the truly interesting question. The roots of the myth lie in the 19th and 20th century European idea of progress. Victorian-era historians and writers often portrayed the Middle Ages as dark, filthy, grotesque, and primitive, because doing so made their own time appear brighter, more civilized, and more hygienic. They were sending a clear message. Look at how terrible our ancestors' lives were. Now look at us. See how far we've advanced. This narrative was so powerful that it seeped into Hollywood, then into television documentaries, and from there into textbooks, spreading everywhere you can imagine. But the deepest reason is psychological. People love hearing that their ancestors lived in disgusting conditions because it makes them feel much better about themselves. Thinking, they ate spoiled meat while we shop in spotless supermarkets, is comforting and makes us feel superior. But this is an illusion. We are not smarter than they were. We simply have more technology. They wanted fresh food just as much as we do. They valued hygiene just as highly, and they struggled to survive just as fiercely, perhaps even more so. The only real difference is that the materials and tools available to them were far more limited. Now I want to talk about real medieval cuisine, because there are many misconceptions here as well. Medieval European cooking was incredibly rich and diverse. When we examine cookbooks from the 14th century, we find detailed descriptions of complex sauces, carefully crafted spice blends, and multi-stage cooking techniques. Yes, spices were used, but for luxury, pleasure, display, and flavor, not to disguise spoiled meat. Medieval chefs, yes, professional cooks did exist back then, used spices skillfully and with great care to balance flavors. Sweet and salty combinations, sour and spicy harmonies, many principles of modern haute cuisine actually originate in medieval cooking. Even the visual presentation of dishes served at noble tables was considered an art form and a source of pride. Peacocks were cooked and then meticulously redecorated with their feathers. Pies were shaped like castles, towers, and city walls. Every dish was a spectacle, a symbol of status. And at the center of all this was one key idea: freshness. Because using fresh ingredients was a sign of wealth, power, and refined taste. So what have we learned today? Not only that a historical myth is false, but also why we are so inclined to believe such myths in the first place. Yes, we want to see ourselves as superior and more advanced, and for that reason, we are often ready to portray the past as darker than it really was. But the truth is this: people in the Middle Ages were not fundamentally different from us. They wanted to eat well, they wanted to be healthy, and they wanted to enjoy life. The only real difference was technology. So the next time someone tells you, people in the past were like this, stop, think, and ask yourself, does this really make sense? Or is it something I want to believe simply because it makes me feel better? Because history is not just about understanding the past, it's about understanding the present more clearly. And unfortunately, sometimes the greatest lessons are learned when we confront what we thought we knew. Thank you for watching, and remember, always keep questioning.